Good morning, class, and welcome to our English lesson for today. Today we are going to be covering lesson 8.4 in your book. Please pause the video and make sure that your book is open to lesson 8.4. Lesson 8.4 is all about restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. This is going off of your adjective clauses that you did for yesterday. Some adjective clauses are actually needed for the sentence to make sense, for it to be clear who the sentence is talking about or what the sentence is talking about. If an adjective clause is needed for the sentence to make sense, it is a restrictive clause because the sentence is restricted into using that clause. Here's an example of a restrictive clause being used in a sentence. The special goddesses who assisted the chief god, Odin, were named the Valkyries. Just like we learned yesterday, your adjective clauses will start with either a relative pronoun or a subordinate conjunction. Here we see the relative pronoun who, starting the adjective clause, who assisted the chief god Odin. This is telling you exactly which special gods we're talking about. It is needed for the sentence to be clear, because otherwise we wouldn't know which special goddesses were named the Valkyries. Which special goddesses were named the Valkyries? The ones who assisted the chief god Odin. Here are two ways that you can know whether or not a phrase is restrictive or non-restrictive. A restrictive clause is not set off by commas. If you see a comma before and after the phrase or the clause, you will know that it is a restrictive clause. Next, the relative pronoun that is generally used for restrictive clauses. If you see an adjective clause starting with the relative pronoun that tells you that you are likely looking at a restrictive clause. If you need to hear this explanation again, please pause the video and rewind the section to the beginning where we talk about restrictive clauses. Or look in your book on page 146 where they have a detailed explanation about restrictive clauses. A non-restrictive clause is not needed for the sentence to make sense. The sentence is not restricted into using this clause. Here is an example sentence that uses a non-restrictive clause. The Valkyries, who rode horses in the sky, were special goddesses in Norse mythology. The adjective clause, who rode horses in the sky, is started by a relative pronoun, just like we learned about yesterday. Who rode horses in the sky is the clause. The sentence doesn't need this clause for it to be clear who we're talking about. We know the Valkyries were special goddesses in Norse mythology because the sentence itself is very specific with a proper noun. Here are three different ways that will help tell you whether or not you are looking at a non-restrictive clause. A non-restrictive clause will be offset by commas. If you look at our example sentence, the Valkyries, comma, who rode horses in the sky, comma, were special goddesses in Norse mythology. If you see those commas, you are looking at a non-restrictive clause. However, in exercise 2, they have removed all the commas from the sentences, so you will need to add them. So you cannot rely on this method in exercise 2, but you can rely on this next one. A proper noun will come before a non-restrictive clause. The proper noun tells you exactly what the sentence is referring to. If you see a proper noun with a capital letter at the beginning, like Valkyries here, before your adjective clause, You are looking at a non-restrictive clause. That will always be the case. So in exercise 2, when you are missing those commas and you can't rely on this first method, this second method will always work. Lastly, the relative pronoun which is generally used for non-restrictive. If you see which, you are likely looking at a non-restrictive clause. Those are the 3 methods to finding out whether or not a sentence uses a non-restrictive clause. First, check commas. Remember, you'll only be able to do this in exercise 1. Exercise 2 has removed all the commas. Second method, a proper noun will come before a non-restrictive clause. If you see a proper noun, you are looking at a non-restrictive clause. Lastly, if you see which, you are likely looking at a non-restrictive clause. If you need a better explanation for non-restrictive clauses, you can rewind this section to the beginning to hear the explanation again, or look on your book on page 146 where there is a detailed explanation of non-restrictive clauses. On the board, I have 3 different sentences. What we are going to do is you are going to decide whether or not each sentence is using a restrictive or a non-restrictive clause based on the methods that we had just talked about. Sentence A, the Valkyries who wore armor did not fight in battle. Pause the video and tell me whether or not this is a restrictive or a non-restrictive clause. Hopefully you said that this is a non-restrictive clause. Well, how did you figure that out? Hopefully you used the 2 of the methods that I told you about in the non-restrictive clause section. If you look, the Valkyries, comma, who wore armor, comma, did not fight in battle. Because you see those commas in front and behind the adjective clause, you know it is non-restrictive. Also, Valkyries, proper noun. Because we have a proper noun coming before the adjective clause, who wore armor, you know that this is a non-restrictive clause. Let's look at sentence B. The goddess who led the Valkyries was named Freya. I want you to pause the video and tell me whether or not this is a restrictive or a non-restrictive clause. Hopefully you said that this is a non-restrictive clause based on the methods that I told you. The goddess who led the Valkyries was named Freya. We do not see commas before and after this clause. That tells us that it's restrictive. Also, goddess is not a proper noun. Therefore, it is a restrictive clause. Let's go to sentence C. The chariot on which she rode was pulled by a boar. Pause the video. Tell me whether or not this sentence has a restrictive or a non-restrictive clause. Hopefully you said that this is a restrictive clause. Why? If you look, there is no comma before the or on, there's no comma before after the road. It is not offset by commas, nor is the word chariot a proper noun. Therefore, it is a restrictive clause. If you need to go through these examples again, you can rewind the video to the beginning of this section. As well as on page 146 in your book, there is a detailed explanation as to why each of these sentences is a restrictive or non-restrictive clause. Please pause the video and make sure that you have a pencil and a piece of paper ready, as well as your book open to pages 146 and 147. Your assignment for today is going to be pages 146 and 147, exercises 1 and 2. We are going to run through the examples for each exercise, just like we do in class. For exercise 1, what they want you to do is first write the adjective clause. How do we find the adjective clause? Exactly what we did yesterday. First, find the subordinate conjunction or the relative pronoun. The Valkyries were goddesses who appeared in Norse myths. We see the relative pronoun who. This starts the adjective clause who appeared in Norse myths. You will write that on your sheet. Please write who appeared in Norse myths on your sheet. Next, after you have written that, you will then tell me whether or not this is a restrictive or a non-restrictive clause. If we look, do we see a comma between goddesses and who? No. Is goddesses capitalized? No. That means that this is a restrictive clause. You must write restrictive clause. That's what you do for exercise 1. Write the whole clause, who appeared in Norse myths, then tell me whether or not this is a restrictive or a non-restrictive sentence. For exercise 2, there's a few more steps that we need to do. First, you will write the clause just like you did in exercise 1. The Valkyries who rode through the sky were Odin's messengers. Do we see a relative pronoun or a subordinate conjunction? See the relative pronoun who. Who rode through the sky? There's our clause. You will write that first on your sheet. Next, we have to decide whether or not this is a restrictive or a non-restrictive clause. But remember what I told you in the non-restrictive section. In exercise 2, they have removed all the commas from the sentences, which will come into play in the next step of your answer. But first, we need to decide, without using any commas, who rode through the sky? Is that a restrictive or a non-restrictive clause? Remember, the proper noun method will always work to decide whether or not a sentence is restrictive or non-restrictive. If we look at the noun before who, we have Valkyries with a capital V. That makes it a proper noun. If a proper noun comes before the clause, we know that this is non-restrictive. You will then write, after your phrase, non-restrictive. The last step, if you get the answer non-restrictive by seeing that there's a proper noun before your clause, you will rewrite the sentence and add the commas where they are needed. The Valkyries who rode through the sky were Odin's messengers. A non-restrictive clause is offset by a comma in front and behind the clause. Who? Sky. That is the 3 steps you will need for exercise 2. First, write the clause. Second, tell me whether or not it is restrictive or non-restrictive. If the clause is restrictive, that's where you can stop. You do not need to rewrite the sentence because it is correct. If you do find that it is non-restrictive by seeing that there is a proper noun before the clause, rewrite the sentence, adding the 2 commas where they are needed. This assignment is going to be due the next time we meet in person. If you have any questions on your assignment, please come to our Zoom session later today where you can ask me in person. Thank you for our lesson, for paying attention to our lesson today, and I look forward to our lesson tomorrow.